So guys, I do want to talk about a tough video today, and it's called the spanking incident, or that time I had to spank my younger brother. And this happened in middle school. So, just to give some context is that, definitely how we raise our children always differs from generations. Like, I remember like in the early 90s, my parents were really strict. They had a lot of expectations on me. And definitely, there's been times I've been slapped. There's been times I've been spanked. There's been other times that I've been grounded for a couple of weeks, and other things like that. But also there have been times too, like I was misdiagnosed. I was misdiagnosed with autism. So I know that there were some times where I got a lot of, he has a disability, get out of jail free cards, and there have been times I've done some very egregious things and I've actually gotten like maybe my dad forgot or whatever, type of thing really. And definitely that's true. I've not always been punished accordingly. And I've always kind of felt that if my dad put me in military school when I started acting out, that would have changed my life, So I'm not perfect either. And there's been times in my life where, as I said, I've gotten the mental illness get out of jail free card, and that's definitely never a good way to raise a kid, because that just teaches, what we're seeing a lot of nowadays, that if you have a mental health issue, maybe discipline is not the right answer. Maybe it's medication, maybe it's infinite chances or stuff like that. But, without further ado, yes, that, we adopted my younger brother in 1999, and definitely it was like my first time. It was like the first time my parents actually had a kid from, the time that they were born all the way to like, until now. And me and my brother were both adopted at 4 years old. So I always kind of felt with my younger brother that definitely being the baby of the group, and definitely kind of coming from that generation, definitely being the baby of the group, and also definitely being born in the late 90s, there was kind of a sense of what I would call empty nest parenting. Like the youngest kid you don't really argue with, the youngest kid you don't really reinforce consequences, the youngest kid you let do whatever they want to do because you're too tired to argue, or sometimes if you have parents that always work, it may be just easier just to work on your career instead of just be an actual disciplinarian. And also too that another thing I had to kind of add as a disclaimer that I think it was like 11 or 12 where my brother was like 11 or 12 I was like 11, my brother was like maybe like 8 or 9 years old when I actually moved out of my parents' house, and I started living with my older brother ever since really. So there's definitely things I didn't see, but this is kind of more about my younger brother when he was like 4, 5, 6 years old. But I remember there's some things that he did, like he would always like back talk. And I also kind of remember like one time I lost respect for my father because I remember my little brother having an allowance to walk one of my dad's small dogs, and then my dad, he was talking back to my dad ignored it, and then he asked me to do it, and then my dad intimidated me and asked me to do it. And I felt like, you can't stand up to a 6 years old, to somebody who's like 8 years old, but you're gonna ask somebody who's in their 20s. So I lost respect for my father because it just showed that it just kind of showed that he just kind of was weak in how he stood up to my younger brother really, and I lost a lot of respect for him like that really. So but the other thing that happened was that I remember I was in middle school, so this had to be 2001 or 2002. I would say like 2002. So my younger brother was definitely probably around maybe like 3 or 4 years old. But there was like sometimes, this was not all the time, but there were times when he had an issue of running out of the house really. So if he wanted to run out of the house and run into the lawn, or think that it's like a game of chase or whatever, he would do that. And I know like one time my dad yelled at him and then my brother was crying and then they're both hugging each other. But there are like in older generations where you did that, you would slap your kid in the mouth, or sometimes you may be like, okay, go outside, and they get hit by a car or they run into a car, you say like, okay, there you go, stupid, and then you bring the kid back in, you spank them again, and then they learn not to be an idiot. But I also kind of remember what happened was we had a babysitter to watch my younger brother, and my younger brother was having a bunch of bad behavior. Like he was definitely like slapping me. He was cursing. He was also. It's one of those things too that we play a video game like Dead or Alive. He'd also be doing like fake kicks or jumping around or whatever, and other things like that. And I also remember like there was a couple of times where he was running in and out of the house. So I actually just had to put him over my knee and I whacked his ass hard as I could, like maybe like over 6 or 7, maybe close to 10 times, but like the hardest slap that I could. Because I remember one time my dad was teasing me when I was like 4 years old, and no, when I was like 6 years old, and I slapped him, and he slapped the shit out of me and knocked me to the ground. Or I remember sometimes when I really misbehaved, or when I was being inappropriate in school, my dad would like he would just slap me like he was beating a grown man, really. So, and I remember like my brother kind of crying and stuff like that. And I remember him going to bed, and I kind of said like, "You get what you deserve," like sleep off your sore ass. And he was a little afraid of me for a while, but he never had that issue ever again of running out of the house. But I also remember when my dad came home, he was mad at me because he told me, whenever there's an issue with my younger brother, I always had to talk to an adult about it. But it was hard for me to talk to adults because I didn't like being a snitch, or I was always kind of afraid to talk about my issues because I know like I had a lot of pent up anger from a lot of things, and especially my younger brother. He would do a lot of just bad behavior, like, okay, I remember like, there was an issue of him, like when my parents were driving, he would lift up his foot and just be kicked. If my parents were driving a car, my brother would be kicking their elbow a little bit so the car can like swerve and whatever. You have a kid who does that, you should knock their ass out. There was another time where he wanted to taste my dad's beer and make a big argument. I used to watch professional wrestling in middle school, but I remember one time my brother making a big stink because he wanted to watch ECW, which was 10 to 11, and one of my dads was like, okay, we'll talk, we'll see, and my other dad was like, no. And it became this whole issue of the youngest kid, now he can talk back to adults. Now he can almost cause traffic accidents. Now he can want to taste a beer. Now he can do things like, I remember like we had my aunt Sandra. We left out some pizza for her, and what happened with my younger brother was like he was picking off the pepperoni from like we left pizza out for her on top of the oven for her to have when she came from the holidays, and other things like that. I mean, she was coming home. She was visiting us for Christmas, so we left pizza on the counter. And my little brother, like 3 or 4 years old, he was picking off the pepperonis and eating it. And my dad was like, "Oh, Jordan!" But like, if me and my brother did that, bam, you get a big smack and knocked to the ground. Or if it was my kid, I would just tell my little kid, like if I had a kid, one of the reasons why I don't have kids is because I grew up with a lot of that type of you slap a kid, and if I had a son who did that, I would slap them in the face. Type of thing, really, because sometimes what we were kind of seeing is a lot of just, he gets a pass because he's a cute little kid, and he kind of just needed a couple of smacks in the face, really, to actually discipline him, and I felt like, that's just what was needed. But those are just other examples. Or he had very horrible eating habits. Like I remember, whenever like we had like, he would eat like meatloaf or whatever, and he'd be throwing like wads of like ketchup on top of it. And then also I remember like when we ordered like Chinese chicken, it was like broccoli and sesame chicken. What he would do is like he would eat the piece of chicken, suck off all the sweet sauce and spit it out, really. And my parents would be kind of cheap, so they'd always make us kind of split it. So I would get all the broccoli, he would get all the chicken just to suck off the sweet sauce and spit the piece of chicken out. And I also like remember, if I can remember one, I'm trying to remember really deeply, that I remember like, one time, I got kind of fed up with his bad eating habits, and I used to call him diabetes just to kind of hurt his feelings and to just motivating him to just have healthier eating habits. And it's like what my dad said, I remember my dad saying, you just need to lay off or whatever. And I was kind of like, I was saying to myself, well, this is the kid, whenever you cook him like meatloaf, he's going to dump like maybe so much ketchup on it that you don't see it. This is the kid who sucks off sweet sauce so he doesn't get to eat chicken. This is the kid, Yeah, this is just like this is the kid. Oh, I remember like the other. I remember. I should talk about the. I'll talk about the salami story. That one time I remember in like in high school, my parents were my little brother wanted unhealthy sandwiches like pepperoni sandwiches. So what happened was my dad was trying to trick my younger brother into eating healthy. So he said, okay, salami and pepperoni are the same thing. So what happened was I didn't know that. So I made my lunch one day, and my brother was screaming and flipping out and cursing and crying to my dad because I made a salami sandwich, and then my dad was like calling salami pepperoni, and I remember my dad saying that I'm autistic, and he started making my sandwiches like my senior year of high school. But I always threw those sandwiches out because if it's really based on two things, it was based on that he was trying to tell my younger brother that salami is pepperoni, and now in the house salami is pepperoni because you can't tell your kid, you know what, Jordan, you can't have fucking pepperoni every fucking day of your life. You know what, you're an unhealthy child. And and clearly you're disgusting with how you eat. That would have been better. But just to call salami pepperoni, and then my dad being passive aggressive is like, okay, well, the solution to all this is that because I didn't hear the message, therefore I'm autistic, I don't know how to make a sandwich, he has to make sandwiches for me. And then later on he tells me that the reason why he was doing that was because he actually wanted to make sandwiches for me because he's going to miss being a father once I go to college. And I mean, fuck my dad for that. But yeah, that just wasn't cool, and that's one of the reasons why I didn't have the best relationship. Once I went to college, I was done, and and even like nowadays, I forgive my younger brother. I understand, raising kids are difficult. Definitely, when we're hard on children, and we have another child, we want to be nicer to that kid because we want like our kids to remember the good times. And sometimes, if you create a lot of good times with your youngest, that's all you really, really need. But I really, really just kind of felt that, when I was whipping his ass, when I was spanking the hell out of him, he really needed that. And I've also read in psychology books, that, definitely spanking is a horrible form of it is child abuse, but it's also the same thing as slapping a kid in the face or verbally abusive or emotional abuse. Because I did grow up with that, like parents like saying inaccurate things about mental health issues or teasing me. But but sometimes they say in those books that if you need to spank a kid, it's okay. If you have a kid that has a serious issue, like there's this woman who her kids were like teenager or like preteens, and they went into somebody's house and they stole a bunch of items. So she took a belt and she was beating her three kids with a belt, and the kids got removed. And then she was saying on television, what's going to happen when well, let's say it's the cops and they see three black kids in a house. They're going to shoot up those black kids. Or what's going to happen if that house belongs to a gang member and they shoot up? What happens if it belongs to a white guy that's racist and the guy shoots the three kids? And they're going to be like, okay, they're going to like have leniency, So I kind of felt that. I really, really just kind of felt that, and I think a lot of people also felt that time with my younger brother that really he needed more discipline. But I did it because, what, yes, I was angry and frustrated, but I felt like, there always had to be a sense of, consequences for your actions, and there really wasn't like that for my younger brother. And there were some times too, like I remember, and I see like this happen at the hospital. Like I remember like, there was a time that I was playing Power Stone. It's a really great video game. It's for like teenagers, T for teen. My younger brother would always like, play that game when my parent wasn't looking. He got caught one time, so my dad took away the video game, even though it was my video game. And then it was also one of those things too, when my brother was punished for 3 days, and he got that reduced. Or there are other times when he got his punishment canceled. So it happens in like I work in a psych ward, and that happens with people as well. That sometimes they get punished and disciplined, and then 2 hours later they're just with everybody when they say no, you're supposed to be away for a day. So he kind of also went with a lot of that type of way too many second chances. So I mean, there's just things that I do want to say that I'm happy to tell these stories, but I do think that when it comes to parenting is very, very hard. You always have to think about how your behavior is going to impact your children. And I remember my parents not always doing that with me, or sometimes, I remember my brother was telling me, like, I used to have an issue with peeing in the car. And one of the reasons why I peed in the car when I was like 4 or 5 years old was because I would be afraid to ask my parents to pull over because they would be like, oh, fuck, or Christ, or whatever. And whenever I peed in the car, my parents would be yelling, screaming at me. And I think my dad told me one time that people were saying, you know what, your kid's going to grow up with a bunch of problems because you're responding like that. And my dad said, I don't care how he turns out. I just want a clean car. So, I mean, I know I said that out of anger, but, that's just not right. But, it was definitely an older attitude. In the 80s and the early 90s, in the late 80s, early 90s when I was born, it was still that last generation of fuck the kid. But there's also times when I've gotten away with stuff. There's times when having mental health issues, being misdiagnosed with autism, there were times where I should have been sent to military school, or I should have received worse consequences for my behavior, and I received no consequences. But I do feel when it comes to parenting that we all have to really discipline our kids. We also need to get back to spanking, I think, and we all need to get back to teaching our kids rules. And if you have kids that are very unruly, sometimes that comes from a lack of parenting. And then also, if we're too old to have kids, or we're too old to actually be there for a parent, we're like, you know what, well, I'm in my 40s, and I'm going to be in my 60s when my kid's done. I feel tired, I'm slowing down a little bit. Do I really want to have a kid? Do I really want to adopt a kid? And or do I want to procreate and have a kid when I know that it's a lot of work, and maybe I can't be as involved, or I can't be as laying down the law, really, but I also think that the other issue is generational trauma. That my dad did open up to me that he was abused, and I also found out that my biological parents were abusive and had neglect issues. And also, I did grow up with emotional abuse. Parents make fun of my mental health issues, breaking my balls, saying inaccurate things, using manipulation, using intimidation, sometimes spanking, sometimes slapping, sometimes, overreacting or throwing furniture or flipping over tables. So I did not grow up in a household of emotional maturity. So I do think that obviously, if I become a parent, I would want to slap my kids. I would want to spank them. I would want to curse them out. And that's one of the reasons why I don't have animals, or I don't want to have kids, is because I know that's what I grew up with. And I know that sometimes the only way to get a point over with a kid that's stubborn or impulsive is that you have to just whip that ass. So I'm happy I'm making the choice not to have kids, because there are some people that may say, okay, well, some kids, you leave out pizza for the kid's grandparents, and the kid just takes a slice of pizza. There may be some people that, as I said, there may be some people that say, okay, we need to let it go. And then there are some parents that are like, okay, well, you need to go in timeout, and we need to have a conversation about that. And then there's some parents who believe that they need to whip their kid's ass, and that's the end of it, or whip their kid's ass and then have a conversation about why that's bad, really. But I do wish that I was kind of raised with more emotional maturity. I do wish that my parents had a lot more experience as parents before me, but that can't always happen. I do understand that I was definitely a very frustrating kid, and I also think that as my parents have gone on, they realize that they've been really hard on me. They've also realized that I think that the thing they always looked at me as a black kid. I'm mixed race. A black kid with autism, or a black kid with mental health issues, when, it's there, but that's not really the whole picture. But, I think for my self-esteem, that's why I really don't hang out with my parents. But I also am happy that I don't want to have kids, or I would not ever want to have kids, because you know what, I know that I would definitely be another generation of emotional abuse, and spanking and slapping is the best way to keep a kid in line. And then what's going to happen with my grandkids or great-grandkids and going on with that. But I do think that I also do believe in those things, because you got to lay down the law with your children. And I do for wholeheartedly believe that it would have been a bad day if my little brother, if I didn't spank my little brother. He kind of just thought it was fun to kind of run out of the house and be chased and think it's a game. It would not be a good day if he got hit by a car. And then the cops were talking to us, and they're like, and I'm like, okay, well, he always does this. My parents, he always does this, and my parents yell at him, and then he cries, and then they have a big hug, and there's no really spanking or whatever. There's no spanking or whatever. And then also, when I told the cops something like, okay, well, I remember one time that I grabbed him and I spanked the hell out of him for doing that, and my parents were more mad at me, and they almost destroyed my video game system, and they told me to go to my room, and I was thinking to myself, you know what, that kid's out of control. He's gonna be one of those kids on the Maury Povich show. You don't lay down the law with this kid. He runs you. He backtalks you. If I told the cops all that, I think they'd probably like, okay, well, definitely my parents need parenting classes, because they can't have a 4-year-old kid running the whole household, type of thing, So yeah, it's hard to raise kids, and definitely when we have children that are misbehaving and they need spanking and that works, you need to do that. If they need military school, that works. But if kids are not getting the message and you're always just like saying, okay, I need to give up on it, or I don't want to argue, it's a sign that, you shouldn't be having any more kids, because you can't do your role as a parent, So that's all I got to say about it. And, my brother's actually a really good kid now, and it's like a terrible twos, and he also had the issue of getting frustrated and not being happy when things don't go his way. Like, I remember, I think it was like 3 or 4 years old, he was talking about personal accountability, and I was like saying, wow, you're more mature than a lot of people, and he went down that road. And that's kind of the thing, he had to learn, is that even though he gets frustrated or things don't go his way, or he may feel like, okay, well, he doesn't, or there's something he wants to do and it ends quickly, and he has to do other things, like he, it may be frustrating to him, but he also has to understand that he lives in a world where you can't do whatever the hell you want, really. But I also think in another way, I'm happy that he has a lot of self-confidence, and my parents allowed that to nurture, because when I grew up, I didn't have a lot of self-confidence, and I would always say, like, one of the reasons why I've had a lot of bosses curse and yell and threaten, or our other coworkers almost beat me up, was because when I was a kid, being cursed at, people calling me stupid, or people saying inappropriate things to me, or my parents sometimes raising my hand and looking like they're about to slap the hell out of me. I grew up to allow myself to get bullied because I thought that was normal, because I did grow up in a household of bully parenting when it came to me, where my younger brother, he kind of came up with a little bit more complacency. But I do kind of think that, in my late 30s, I just know how to handle my life. My younger brother knows how to handle his life. And it's almost like, what, I don't have that many hard feelings towards him. But definitely during that time, I really felt that it was very clear he needed a little bit more harshness.